Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to the sixth and final session of the Board of Directors training series for creating resilient board members in the era of COVID-19. My name is Mark Clark, and I'll serve as your host this afternoon. I'd like to ask you to, as you enter the room, enter your name, your agency, your tribal affiliation, and your position within the agency in the chat box. That way we'll be able to know who we're kind of conversational atmosphere for today's session. We'll get underway in a few moments as people enter the room. Again, we ask you to enter that information, your name, agency, position at the agency, and tribal affiliation. Thank you. Just as a reminder, again, as you're entering your information in our chat box, this webinar is being recorded. Your mics have been muted unless you've been otherwise directed. We will be able to unmute your mics as the session continues for Q&A. Please turn your camera on to allow for a fun interaction with one another so we can see who we're talking with. This is a 2-hour session with a planned break inside that'll be dictated by our presenters, 5 minutes at least. We'll see how that goes. Your participation includes polling in breakout rooms, and your questions as they occur to you can be typed into our chat box. We'll carefully monitor the chat box so that we can ensure that all your questions are addressed. And again, there may be a Q&A session that will allow for mics to be unmuted so that you could verbalize your question. Slides and recordings will be available at the link you see on the screen, and we'll make sure they're available to all of our participants. Eventually, they're archived on our landing page in the NCUI web homepage. There's going to be an evaluation. There'll be a link that we'll provide for you at the end of the session, and we ask for your feedback. It only takes a few minutes to complete that online evaluation. So we look forward to seeing your feedback about the series. Thank you. Next slide. Oops, we missed a slide. Today's session is the entitled Board Self-Evaluation Tools and UIO Case Study. Our presenters are Tony Scucci and Luis Cervantes. This, again, is the 6th and final session of our Board of Directors member training. Thank you. Next slide. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Tony Scucci is an organizational and clinical consultant based in Portland, Maine, with more than 40 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. He was a senior governance associate with BoardSource for 16 years, and he is a certified governance trainer and an executive coach. Over the past 15 years, Tony has provided governance effectiveness training sessions for over 30 urban Indian health organizations and the National Council for Urban Indian Health. He has also served as an executive coach to Urban Indian Health Organization executive directors. He has facilitated strategic planning sessions for many UIOs, the National Indian Health Board, and the Tribal Leaders Diabetes Committee. Tony worked with the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development over the past several years, provided board training, guided a strategic planning process for them, and managed a successful executive leadership transition. In his personal life, Tony serves on the steering committee of Welcoming the Stranger. This is a grassroots community-based group supporting asylum seekers. They assist with immigrants in preparing for U.S. citizenship, and he volunteers regularly as a cook at the Preble Street Resource Center in Portland, Maine. Tony graduated with a BA in sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and with a master's in social work from Boston College. He is a licensed master social worker in the state of Maine. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Luis Cervantes serves as the United American Indian Involvement's Chief Executive Officer. He previously served UAII as the Chief Financial Officer from 2016 to 2019. Mr. Cervantes has served in the nonprofit sector for nearly 20 years in Los Angeles. These agencies that he served with provide veteran services, educational support, workforce and homeless services, assisted living, substance abuse disorders, religious institutions and charter schools, and other health and human services. Louise has managed awards of 130 million in an annual budget, including an endowment, and over 450 million in assets. He serves on the board of directors of a mental health services agency, El Centro de Amistad, serving 4 years as president. He received his Bachelor of Science from California State University, Northridge, and has obtained a Master's of Business Administration from Corban University. Thank you. Next slide. Um, it's time for our presenters to begin. So I'm going to pass the baton to Tony as we begin the today's program. Again, just a reminder, make sure your information is entered in our chat box as we get underway. Thank you, everyone. Tony?
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. Appreciate it. And also want to thank not just you, but Noel and the other staff at NCUI to help get this thing set up and for the technical support you provided. I'm really excited to do this with Luis. The way we've planned this session is to, I'm going to talk some about kind of more generic issues around board self-assessments. And I will invite Luis to kind of share his unique perspective as the CEO of one of the urban programs in Los Angeles. And so it'll be kind of an academic and then a kind of personal, kind of anecdotal aspects to the presentation. I want to invite you to ask questions anytime. You could do that right in the chat box. Please just put them in there. And if Mark or Noel could just kind of help me keep track of them, that would be really appreciated. Don't worry about typos and spelling. No one's going to see it. The other thing I want to just say up front is that in doing this, this board self-assessment training, I'm going to reference for most of it, the very tool that I use and the process that I use when I'm doing this. And it's a comprehensive online survey. There's a data analysis component to it and so on. But that's the tool that I'll be referencing. And towards the end of the session, I'll share some samples, some excerpts from that tool to give you some sampling of ideas about the kind of performance indicators you would include in an assessment. I would just say up front that this is a tool I use. I find it to be the best in the business. I've used it for many, many years. It's been tested out statistically and all those other methodological ways that statisticians do this stuff. So that's the tool I use, but I would also say that there are all kinds of tools out there, and to emphasize that if you're doing any kind of board self-assessment, what matters most of all is the process. The process is what's key. The tool simply has to be a good enough tool to support your process. So what we're doing today in terms of our goal is just to learn a little more about board self-assessments, what an assessment is, how it can really bring value to your organization. We'll look at some basic elements of the tool, talk a little bit about the kind of obstacles and the benefits. And as I said, I'll share some sample documents with you as well. And then just before we take a break, I think I will also share with you a kind of a template of an analysis report, which is kind of an action plan. And I think it's important to keep in mind that you're going to go through this entire assessment process. It doesn't end when you complete the process. It only begins really. It's once you've identified what's working well and where you want to make improvements, the next step is to figure out an action plan, so how you can actually act on the findings of your assessment. So the topics we're going to cover, I want to just define and just be clear what it is we're talking about when we talk about a board self-assessment. And the key words here are self and assessment. So this is very much a kind of a subjective process. This is not objective in any way. Objective, it's simply asking board members to share their perceptions of the board's performance. We'll look at key elements in terms of the process and the tool. I will invite Louise to join in many places here around why you would undertake this to begin with, when might be a good time to be doing a board self-assessment, and what are some ways in which you might do that. What are the things, ways you can benefit, but what are the things that get in the way? What are those barriers to moving forward and looking at your board's performance in this way? And then taking action, as I said earlier. And it's really about looking at the data that you collect, trying to make sense of it, interpret it, see what kind of meaning you can derive from it. And from that, come up with an action plan. I'm going to ask you a poll question. I just kind of get a sense of folks. And so I'm going to, I think Noelle is the person who put this up there, but I'm just curious, has your board ever conducted a board self-assessment? It's a simple yes or no. There's no right or wrongs here. But if you would just quickly respond to that and give us a sense of whether you've done this before or not, in any way that you understand the term. We'll give just a few more seconds if you would respond. It's a simple yes or no. And I think all these responses are anonymous, so you don't have to worry about anybody knowing who's responding. Well, that's very telling. Thank you. Let's close the poll. It's really interesting to look at this because some of you have done this, some of you really have not. But then there's a significant number of folks who really are not quite sure. And that's a good thing. That you're participating in this training is an opportunity to think more about what this is and how might I consider using it. So I thank you for jumping in on that. It gives me a good picture of where we are. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is another polling question. And I would ask you to just take a minute and kind of reflect on your board and just think about, on a scale from 1 to 4, how would you characterize your board's effectiveness? If you were outstanding, if you were like in the major leagues, you would be a 4. If you are kind of struggling along, you might be a 2 or a 3. If you feel like your board is not very effective at all, you might be a 1. And again, there's no right or wrongs about this. We're just trying to get a measure on how your participants in the training. And we'll let the poll go maybe another few seconds. Okay, I think we can end the polling now, and I think this is very striking. Overwhelmingly, folks participating in this training see their boards at a 3. Some people see the board as a 4, that your board really is highly effective. What I would ask you to do is to think about for a minute, what would it take for your board to move from the number it's at to the next number up? What is something that your board could do, or what might be something that you could do to move your board from whatever level you're at now to the next level up? It's important to keep in mind that when we do the self-assessment, we're really looking at where your performance level is right in the moment. And from that point forward, building on those strengths. So this really shows that the folks on this call, on this training, are coming from boards that really are pretty effective. And so that means your work is simply, how do we take what we're doing really now and build on those strengths, and what are some things we can do to really improve our performance? So you're all at a really good starting point. Let me take a minute and define what a board of self-assessment is. And let me first of all tell you what it's not. This is not a test. A lot of times people think of it as taking a test and they want to get a good score. It's really a matter of trying to determine what your board does well and where it can make improvements. It's similar in some ways to when you do a strategic planning session and you identify strengths and weaknesses. What is it that we do well? We need to know what that is. We need to celebrate that. And we also have to look at how can we build on that. And to be honest and say, well, there's some things we could do better. And what can we do to improve that performance in those areas? It's a conscious effort to move from whatever level you're at now up to the next level. And it's important to keep in mind that it's a conscious effort. This doesn't happen by example, by accident. Um, it's striking when I think about how many times I've asked boards and board members, have you ever done a board self-assessment? And many of them say no. So if you're in the group that's done this already, you are in a very select group. Most nonprofit boards simply do not do this. Um, and there's some reasons for that. We can talk about them in a little bit, but this is a conscious effort. You have to put energy into it. You have to find a way to invest in it and then get a return on that investment. And it's all based on this belief that if you're going to improve your performance, the first step is to look inward and assess. And that's true of an organization, it's true of a board, it's true of a team, it's true of us as individuals. If we're going to improve the way we live our lives, we always begin by stopping and reflecting and looking inwardly, trying to take a measure of who we are as a person. Let me also say, this is probably a good time to say this, that doing a board self-assessment in a lot of ways, I think of it, when I talk about strategic planning, I use the same kind of metaphor. You can do this, the metaphor is about going into the supermarket and walking down the aisle where you buy milk. Now you can buy milk at 3% or 2%, or you could buy skim milk. And the same is true with doing a strategic planning process, and the same is true with doing a board self-assessment process. You can do this at any level that makes sense to you, that fits your budget, and so on. So it's a matter of figuring out what's the right fit for you. This assessment that you do, whenever you do one or if you've done one, it really gives you a snapshot, a picture, a moment in time. This is the way we look right now. It's like putting a mirror up in front of your board and trying to make sense of what that image is. What is that picture? What is that telling us? So as you think about this, it's a moment in time, get a sense of how you're doing. And that's basically what this is. It's trying to take a picture in this one moment. So we come to the question, why would you bother doing this? And I guess I would put this question to you, Luis, if you would take a few minutes to share with us. Can you give us a sense of your situation at the moment with your board in your organization? And what are some of the whys behind you thinking about doing this?
Yes, well, hi, everyone. As was mentioned earlier, I serve on a board that I've been on for about 6 years now. And 4 of those years has been as president. I came in, honestly, brand new. I still remember this. And like within 2 months, I became the VP. And then after that year, I became president. And I was curious, why would I be placed in as a VP right away and then as president of this board of 9 members? Like, I mean, it was a highly skilled group of people. But what I think the reason is I've had a long history in the nonprofit sector, and a lot of our board was comprised of people in the corporate sector, which is okay. But it was causing some challenges, I think, with the CEO and the goals, and it wasn't meshing well. And I came in and I kind of brought life to what nonprofits do, and it really helped educate the board. What's realistic? What's a mission alignment? And you know, some board members were probably on there just for a very long time, and they felt bad leaving the board, but maybe it was also time to transition. So what really prompted a board assessment really came at the strategic plan. We started working on a strategic plan for the entire agency, and then I noticed that when it came to the board components, it wasn't very detailed and concrete, and it didn't tell me anything. You know, we had this huge area for the program and the goals for the CEO and diversifying funding and all that. But I started thinking, well, what's going to be our role in this? So we actually decided to put some attention to this, to not finalize the strategic plan until we understood what the board's goals were actually going to be in that. And we weren't just going to take whatever was listed there the years before, which was, I think, what was happening. I wanted something, and so what I wanted to know is who's on our board. I knew what their titles were, their career, and where they worked. Some were retired, but that still didn't tell me why they were on the board and how they wanted to contribute to the board. So part of wanting to do a self-assessment was that, and I still recall one of the board members that was in, they were more like in the finance side of things in their career. And they actually told me, I'm on the board. Honestly, I don't want to necessarily serve this entity because of my finance background. I actually want to serve on the board because I really want to help on the programmatic side of things. I was like, wow, okay. I was don't find like why? I mean, I understand why we wanted that person on the board. So we started finding out those things. So part of the assessment for us is get who's on our board, what are their skills, what are they interested in? Also for me, what kind of board are we going to have? Are we going to have a fundraising type of board? Because that changes the dynamic. Or are we going to start looking at shifting this board based on these goals? And if they don't meet this criteria, will they be willing to step down? So, I mean, it got that deep, and I was able to do that only because I know I had their full trust as a board president at that time. And they relied a lot on me because I was speaking the nonprofit lingo. I understood grants, I understood program set, I understood operations, HR, I understood all that, compliance, all the reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to have these one-on-one conversations as a board president with each member, but then I would have teams as a group. I never did a meeting like a gotcha meeting or anything like that. Everything was laid out. So that was one. And so really that was ultimately what prompted our wanting to do a board assessment.
That's great, Luis. You know, there's two things that I pull out of what you were saying that strike me. One is that you did this kind of tying it to a strategic planning process. And that's really a good way to think about when is a good time to do a board of self-assessment as part of the strategic planning process. The other thing that you said is really kind of interesting too, because in doing an assessment, board members will actually learn more about what the roles and responsibilities of a nonprofit board are. A lot of times we try to recruit people from the corporate sector to come onto our boards. And if we don't give them opportunities to learn how to be nonprofit board members, they're going to come on and they're going to want to do what they do in the corporate world. They're going to want to manage things. So it's really a matter of helping people better understand how this is a different kind of a role, and there's different ways that you can contribute. You know, I think that when you look at the basic reasons why you would bother to do this, you obviously want to measure how effective your board is, and to identify strengths and weaknesses. There are opportunities here for learning, as we were just talking about. Just doing a board self-assessment, board members, you know, for example, there'll be a performance indicator question. You know, for example, does the board review the IRS 990? And you may find board members saying, what's that? Or, gee, I didn't know we were supposed to. So these are opportunities for people to actually learn a lot of different aspects about serving on a nonprofit board. It's a great way to identify when you have differing opinions and perceptions. If you have board members who are looking at issues from different perspectives, that's almost always a really good, healthy thing. But if people are looking at something and they're all seeing it very differently, you have to ask the question, what does that mean? How is it that some of us think we do really well on one performance indicator and some of us think we do poorly? Well, the purpose of the assessment is to simply put that on the table and try to make sense of what that means. I think too that one of the important things I always say to folks is that when you do anything in the nonprofit world, you really have to think at how can you leverage whatever you're doing. And I believe, and I've seen this many times, that you increase your credibility, not only on the part of the board and staff, but also the people that fund you and other community providers and key stakeholders when you kind of put the word out that we take governance so seriously that every couple of years we do a thorough assessment so we can continue to improve. And it's the same thing you do with your programs and services. You know, you don't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Every now and again, you're evaluating. You're making sure that you're doing things in a way that's best practices and so on. Build trust, respect, and communication. Promote teamwork. One of the common characteristics of a team is that people come together around a common purpose. And when you come together for the purpose of assessing your own performance, that's very fundamental. The other thing I'll say about this process, and certainly the process I use and the tool that I use, is that it brings to the surface sometimes some issues that are just under the surface that people have a hard time bringing up. In some ways, it's like the idea of the elephant in the room. This process just matter-of-factly puts stuff on the table and says, this is the picture. You know, it's not making judgments. It's not blaming anyone or personalizing things. It's simply saying, this is the picture we're looking at. What does it tell us? We want to kind of take a little time and put folks into a smaller group. So we're gonna break out into two small groups. So there'll be two rooms. And what I'd like you to do in your breakout room is to kind of reflect for a minute and then share with each other something that your board does particularly well. Also something that you're thinking about doing, some idea, some opportunity that might be on the horizon for you. And then the thorn, okay? This is the rose, the bud, and the thorn. So like anything else, you know, the roses look beautiful, the bud has the hope, the aspiration, but there's always some thorns along the way. So you might just share with each other in your group something your board doesn't do particularly well. So we'll go into breakout groups for about 10 minutes and just kind of talk a little bit in a smaller group about this, what your board, something your board does really well, something that you're really thinking about that might be a great idea, and also something that's not working so well, something you would like to improve in terms of your board's performance. So in a sense, we're doing kind of really brief microcosm of an assessment here. So I'm going to ask Noel to kind of put us into breakout groups, and if you would just bring us back together in 10 minutes, Noel. Terrific. I'm just curious from, I can't remember whether I was in room A or B. But the room I wasn't in, so the group like that was with Luis, is there some kind of highlight that came out of your conversation you want to share with others?
Roseanne, do you want to share anything from? It was just Roseanne and I really, Gian who's in the CUI, so it was just two of us.
I would just say having the opportunity to reflect, because I'm a newer board member, and so just being able to hear maybe other people's experiences, especially Luis. And then I think that was the highlight, was just hearing, you know, what others are doing, because I'm new as a board member, less than a year. So, but I think also understanding the dynamics of each board. You know, some may have well-seasoned board members, and then some may have emerging leaders, but also making sure that we have a balance of both perspectives.
Wow. Yeah. You know, it's striking. In my group, there were two new people, relatively new to boards as well. And when I think about the metaphor of the rose, the flower itself, and then the bud and the thorn, well, your newness puts you in the bud category. You are like you are the future of the board and the organization. You're the newness, you're the emerging ideas. And you know, I always say this to folks, that when you're new on the board, you bring a certain kind of value that seasoned board members cannot bring anymore. And that's newness. You bring new ideas, new way of thinking about things. You may not have the depth of history and wisdom because you're relatively new. So you can't bring that. And that's what you look to the more senior board members to bring. So that's great. You know, I would just say that if I ask if Laura or Lisa wanted to add anything to the conversation, please feel free to unmute yourself and do that. Okay.
Hi.
Go ahead, Lisa, please.
Hi. Just, as far as being a patient at the Indian Health Center in Santa Clara Valley, and I'm new to the board of directors. I'm proud to be a part of this wonderful organization. They've been there for 4 generations of my family, and just the fact that the board of directors are #1 in my book. The staff involvement and the teamwork. We've got some really good things going, and I know what my job is. I realized and figured out what my calling is, so I can't wait to implement some things. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. You remind me that there, 2 kind of things that jumped out for me. One you were just saying is that when you talked about getting feedback, it's this very idea of if you're going to improve your performance, if you're going to improve the way you serve your patients, you have to be asking your patients the question, how are we doing? What could we do to improve the way we deliver services? And that's an ongoing practice, and that becomes part of the culture of your organization. And I think Rosanna was saying too, that one of the things that struck me is that what we don't do often enough in a board meeting is to simply take some time and reflect. Somebody's always talking, right? But to simply say, here's a question or here's a problem. Let's just take a few minutes and be silent and reflect on this and then share our thoughts. You'll get much deeper thoughts that way. Thank you all for doing that, for sharing. I think I have to go back to sharing my screen again. I'm pretty sure I have to do that. So I apologize for getting lost in this somewhere, but let me get to where we were. So let's go to looking at the way we do this. So, one of the things we have to do is collect data. So in my breakout group, for example, Lisa talked about that as a patient, she talked to somebody about the way she was treated by a medical provider. That's a way to get data. Now, when we want to do this in a more methodical way, the way that I do this in my practice is to start with some kind of survey. Things that I would consider about a survey and about getting data. One is that we want quantitative data. So we really want to have performance indicators where you can actually score them. In my case, we score 0 to 4, 0 being low, 4 being really high. So you're asking board members, based on your perceptions on this performance indicator, what would be the score you would give us? And then the qualitative comments, those are the things that really give context to the numbers. When I do these assessments, there's always a comment place for all the performance indicators. So it's not just a matter of saying, I'm going to put a 2 down here. Tell me why you put the 2. What is it how do you explain a 2 versus a 1 or a 3? So collecting data, you want to do it in a way that you get quantitative and qualitative data. The other thing you want to do in this process, and why I think is important fundamentally, is because whatever results you get gives you a measure of your organization today. If you were to go out and do the same assessment 2 years or 3 years down the road, you're going to get different numbers, and you want to see the scores going up. You want to see the trend line moving up. Another area or element of the survey really has to do with a checklist of practices. So the tool I use asks about 20 questions, and there's simply yes or no questions about practices in their organizational practices, their board practices, their oversight practices. And I'll share with you some samples of that. I also want to get from board members the degree to which they're satisfied with the board's effectiveness, with the level of commitment of board members, and their own personal satisfaction. Do I feel satisfied? Do I feel that serving on this board is rewarding for me? And that's really important, because to come and serve on a board, it's mostly about giving, but there has to be some kind of sense that your giving is making a difference, that you feel better as a person, you feel more purposeful because you're contributing on the board. And then I also like demographics. I want to know what's the size of the board. I want to know what the mix of the board is. You know, in my breakout group, Laura was saying, you know, her board is very diverse, and diversity in terms of people's skill sets and perceptions and so on. That's really important. Diversity, when you have a diverse group of people, you make better decisions. When I think about board size too, I think about, it's about Goldilocks, you know. You don't want your board to be too small. You don't want your board to be too big. You want it to be just right. And just right means enough people that you're kind of reflective of the community you serve, and at the same time, not too many people so that you can't really have good, deep, deliberative discussions. So those are the elements or the components that are in the assessment that I use. So when is it a good time? When is it worth a good time to be doing this? So Luis, I'm gonna go to you and say, what made it a good time in your situation? What made the timing seem good to you?
A couple of things. One of them is we started experiencing some board turnover after we had agreed on the strategic plan for the board. And one of the areas is we wanted to incorporate a give and or get policy. And there were board members that were very uncomfortable trying to raise money. Now, that naturally did that. That wasn't our intention, because the idea was that we were going to do this as a team, not so much an individual, but we wanted to at least say that each individual, at least even if you gave $5, as long as it contributed to the team, because we also understood in order for us to go after philanthropy funding, they asked, what does your board do? How much does your board contribute? And we wanted to be able to say 100% of the board contributed. Now, some of us raised more money than others, but the board dynamic then shifted, right? It became like a hybrid board, meaning half of them were corporate sector doing real well, and then nonprofit folks. And actually, that's a question on the results. I won't answer that part. So it was really the policy and incorporating that. And what was interesting is the people that we thought would be the ones to bring in the money were the ones that quit the board. So we were like, oh no, we were banking on those people. They didn't want to go to their circle of friends and, you know, raise money for the agency. I'd say that was really it. It was the turnover, and part of it was the policy.
Yeah, when I think about that, I mean, as soon as you introduce money into the conversation, it just changes things. When I think more kind of generally about when is a good time to do this, and you talked about this already, part of your strategic planning process, that's good timing. You just talked about high turnover, that's a good time. When you feel that board members are disengaging, or when they're not really clear what their job is, when you get a sense of that, this is a good time to step back and really assess your performance. When you've got so much conflict or complacency on the board that it's getting in the way of you accomplishing anything, that's really a key too. I mean, when you have conflicts on your board, they tend to be the kind of things that can be kind of personal, kind of be just under the surface sometimes. Just finding a way to constructively figure out what's going on here. I always find that sometimes in a board meeting or in boards, people step on each other's toes, but they seldom do that in any deliberate way. It just happens sometimes because we're human beings. You do something thoughtlessly, or you lose your temper, or whatever it might be. What matters is that you just get it out there so you can look at it constructively and do something about it. When there's a change in leadership or some kind of financial crisis, these are often good times to be thinking about stepping back and doing an assessment. Often when I work with a nonprofit board and the chief executive is leaving, I would encourage them, before you go and hire somebody new, let's take a little time and take stock at where we are now. How are we doing? And that helps you make better decisions about the leadership you need going forward. I want to add one other thing too, because I know this whole series, one of the theme throughout all this series that Nikuli's put on has to do with how do we manage ourselves during COVID-19. And from my perspective, one of the things that comes out of this pandemic is that because people are so shut down now and using technology and isolated, this is a good time to do a board self-assessment, mostly because you can do it remotely. It fits the technology, the remote technology, it fits it very well because it's about surveying people, it's about people reflecting individually and then coming back together, and really kind of taking stock of the organization. So if there ever was a really good time, generally speaking, to do a board self-assessment, it would be during a similar kind of shutdown as we're going through now. What comes as a result of this? What are the results? What are the lessons that we learn going through this? One of the things that comes out of this is there's a renewed commitment. Board members are re-energized. Often board members will learn a lot of new things. There's clarity about what's my job and what's not my job. And that's one of the areas where you often get into tensions and conflicts, between the staff and the board members, where people sometimes can step on each other's toes. People get clear about how the board contributes in terms of its committees, expectations of board service, identifying people who are not really pulling their weight. So if you've ever had board experience, you know that there's often somebody on the board who just doesn't really do their share, doesn't show up, not really engaged. It's really difficult to deal with that unless you have a context for it. And by just doing an assessment like this, it gets those issues out on the table, helps identify people who are not doing what they could be doing.
Hi,
And
Tony,
go
I was
ahead.
just, I'm sorry, I didn't want to just interrupt you. There was a interesting comment in the chat box I wanted to share with you
Oh, please do, Mark. Yeah.
from Roseanne. The question about board self-assessment: is it better to implement the self-assessment when the phase of high turnover rate has passed?
That's a great question, Rosanna. In my way of thinking, if you've had a lot of people cycle off your board and you're down to very few, my suggestion would be to actively recruit new people and make sure you're clear about what you're asking them to do and give them responsibility so they feel a sense of purpose. And after they've been on for a while and you have some of a track record, that might be a good time to do a board self-assessment. If you have a larger board and you realize some folks are just cycling off and there's a little too much turnover, as long as you have a critical mass of people who can respond to the questionnaire, to the survey. A third thing I'll say is another way of thinking about this, and these are just different ways of thinking about this. It's a great question. Another way to think about it is if you've had a lot of people that have just left the board and you have a bunch of people that are still behind, what you might do is to try and do this assessment and invite input from everybody, including those people who recently cycled off your board, because they have some perspective, and that might help you better understand why they left to begin with. So I hope that's helpful. And thank you for that question. I appreciate that.
There was a related question, and I don't know if this ties into the similar discussion, but also from Rosanna, the question about if a skills matrix would be considered a type of assessment for boards.
A skills matrix, and so I'll make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, it would be kind of like a grid that lists the various skill sets you're looking for and whether board members, where they fit, which skills they bring. And it's kind of, it gives you a snapshot picture of your board members and their particular skills. And what it does is it identifies where there are gaps, where you have a particular need and you look and you realize no one has that particular skill. So that's a helpful tool for recruiting board members. And it is a helpful tool in that it gives you a picture of the composition of your board in terms of skill sets. That's a great picture. It's not a complete picture because it's looking at just one aspect of this, but it's certainly a great tool to use. And if you have one, I would encourage you to use it. And if you don't, it's something to consider. It answers the question, how do we pay attention to the mix of skills we have on this board so we can tap into all that talent? If you don't know what those skills are, you're not going to be able to tap into that talent, and you're not going to know what's missing. I'll share with you the quick example I think of all the time. I use this when I do trainings. If your board decides that you really want to become known in your community, that you provide great services and nobody even knows who you are, and you say, okay, we need to do a big public relations campaign, and you look around the boardroom and you say, well, no one here knows how to do that. Well, that then logically says, okay, we have a skill gap here. Let's find somebody in the community who believes in our mission and wants to come in and bring those talents and help us get known in the community. So that's just a kind of simple example of identifying a gap and trying to find a way to fill it.
Thank you. That's
We also say bring on new board members. Board self-assessment is a great way to enhance the orientation process as well. When you come onto a board, especially if you're new to board service, there's so much you need to know. You're not going to learn it all at one time. You're not going to sit down in a training for 2 hours and learn it all. You're going to learn it in a process over time. So part of an orientation, going through a board assessment would be a helpful thing to do. Things get in the way of doing this. As I said earlier, many nonprofit boards never stop and look inward at how are we doing, trying to measure our performance and improve our performance. There are obstacles, things get in the way to that. I will go to you again, Luis. What were some of the things that got in the way of you trying to move your board along this road?
Well, we don't have this now, but we did have a few board members that were kind of like disgruntled because of the shift. So I, as a board president, I had several conversations with a few of these individuals, and I kind of gave them the ultimatum, like if they want to be on this board and contribute to the success of the agency, which is what this was about. It wasn't about doing things the way it was done 15 years ago, but about what's needed today. And so that person's still on the board and contributing, which is great.
Oh, terrific.
And in other situations, I found ways through the policy to remove them from the board. I did too, actually, like a couple months from each other. So those were some of the, I would say, were some of the obstacles that we had.
Yeah, I know, and I find too that sometimes you just have resistant board members. A lot of times boards don't do this because they just don't take the time. There's a cost involved if you want to do this. As I said, it's like buying milk. I mean, you're still going to pay for that quart of milk. You have to decide whether you want to spend a lot or a little. But this is one of those things where you need to invest some resources to do this in a really comprehensive way. One of the obstacles is, like I think you were just saying, Luis, is the resistance to change. Some people just don't want to change, and some people are not able to change. That's just human nature. A lot of times it matters whether the chief executive decides this is important. For those in the training who are CEOs, you have such power to influence and shape the future of your organization. If you determine that this is a valuable process, you can make that happen, or you can certainly strive to make that happen. But if you are someone who doesn't want to spend any time or energy on this, then it's not likely to happen. It really takes some kind of leadership and commitment to move it forward. Sometimes boards don't do this because they simply don't even know. They don't even think about it. And I use the word ignorance, not in a negative way, but simply not knowing. They didn't have the idea to do an assessment. We tend to kind of stay on autopilot most of the time. Sometimes the obstacle is just an inability to be honest with ourselves. In order to do this and to do it well, you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be able to say, I'm going to hold that mirror up, I'm going to look in there, and I'm going to look at that picture and try to make sense of it. And whatever it is, I don't know until I hold the mirror up. So it takes a certain amount of courage to be able to say, let's do this. Because you're saying we're going to go down a road and we don't really know where it's going to lead us, but we know it's the road we need to go down. So those are just some examples of some obstacles that get in the way. We're going to take like a 10-minute break. And maybe on the break, if there are other questions in the chat, I'll take a quick look, or if you do, Mark, and if there's questions we haven't responded to. Continue to think about any questions you may have, please, and continue to add to the chat box any of your comments as well. We'll take 10 minutes and we'll come back and we'll talk about the tool that I use, and we'll go through some samples of that. And I hope that'll be a little more nuts and bolts kind of stuff for you to focus attention on. So we'll take a 10-minute break, and I would invite everyone to please get up and get away from the screen.
Thank you.
Go do some jumping jacks.
We'll come back at 16 minutes after the hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 2:16. Welcome back from your 10-minute break.
Well, you were right on the money, Mark. Welcome back, everybody. So we've got about 40 minutes or 45 minutes or so to kind of go through this next part. I hope you all did get up and take a break from your screen just to kind of move a little bit. I know how hard it is to do some of these things with the computer, although we're all getting better at it because we're all practicing. So what I want to do now is kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the tool that I use and the process that I use. And I'll give you some excerpts from that, some samples to give you an idea of what this all is about. So when I look at the board assessment tool that I use, I break things down into the people, the culture, the work, and the impact. And so it's really the who and the what and the how. So when you think about it, looking at your board's performance, these are the different parts to it. There's the composition of your board, the way your board is structured, the way you come together and meet. So there are performance indicators asking questions about those things. The culture, really distilled down, that's simply answering the question, how do we treat each other? How do we make new people feel welcome? How do we demonstrate respect for elders? How we do our work, that's the culture part. And then the work itself of the board, it's setting the direction for the organization. So you want to ask questions about that. How well are we doing on that? What could we do better? What are some areas around this that we don't do well? Program oversight, making sure that the programs and services that you deliver are research-based, that there's evaluation components, that you're doing the right stuff, and that you're treating your patients, your clients in a respectful way and making a difference in their lives. Financial oversight is all the stuff that has to do with managing the resources. I always, when I think about financial oversight, I always try to remind folks that if you're serving on a board, you are in fact a trustee, and that means you are entrusted with somebody else's money. It's not yours. You're entrusted with someone else's money to advance your mission and to spend that money in a way that's frugal, that's ethical, and so on. The partnership between the board and the chief executive, really, that's the critical partnership. So you want to be able to take a measure of how are we doing around that. And I'll share some examples of some of the performance questions around that as well. And then funding and public image. Luis talked about, trying to have the board shift gears to go out and try to raise money. That's part of a responsibility of a board member, is to make sure there's resources. And then the public image part is a board member, you're really an ambassador for your organization. So when you're out in the community, how you talk about your organization really matters. And then the impact questions have to do with what's the difference? What's the difference we're making in terms of the people we serve? So these are like the 4 buckets, and everything in my performance assessment tool falls underneath these 4 buckets. This next page, I'm showing you a page from an assessment report that I wrote. So after collecting all the data, these are the scores of a particular client organization that I worked with recently. And in my report to that board, and I'll show you some samples of that in a little bit, you'll see this slide again. So here we have a board where there were 23 board members and 22 participated. So 97% of their board participated in the assessment, which is like a really good thing. And as I said earlier, the assessment is an online tool, an online questionnaire. And as I mentioned the 4 buckets earlier, there's the people, the culture, the work, and the impact. And then these responsibilities nest underneath those different roles. Then I put their average scores for each of these down in this column, and they also include benchmark scores in my work. And so the benchmark scores, these are the averages of about 1,500 nonprofit boards that have done this very board self-assessment. And so you can see in this client's how they have done in their scores relative to their benchmarks, and they exceed benchmarks. So this is just a board that looks pretty good. These scores are really pretty solid. This is a pretty high functioning board. I want to share with you some samples of when I talk about performance indicators. Ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion is a performance indicator. How are we doing on that? Are we doing that well, or is that an area we need to improve? Mission and strategy, that's part of the work. You know, are we supporting the organization's mission? The culture, are we fostering an environment that builds trust and respect within the board members? And this is a question you want to ask. And when you ask the question, you're going to get feedback, and you may have some board members saying, we could do this better. Or you may have a real affirming kind of response that, yeah, we give it a high score. We do this. We really take care of each other and respect each other. Financial oversight. So here's an example, complying with the IRS 990. Do we do that? You know, and that's a performance indicator. How do we do in terms of public image? Do we project a positive public image of the organization? Program oversight, and then CEO. So these are examples of performance indicators where you would ask the scaling question from 0 to 4, and also would invite comments on all of these. So that's an example of, I kind of extracted some of the performance indicators from the tool. I'm going to share with you now, and this is the one slide that's not the tool that I use, but this is excerpted from another mini assessment tool that I've used sometimes. So if you were thinking about this, this would be the skim milk. This would not be the 3%. And it really comes down to a one-page survey with these basic, simple questions that you would distribute to your board members, and simply asking the question and getting a response of yes, somewhat, or no. So a question would be, you know, do you have a board member job description that lists your expectations? Do we? Well, yes. Do we have something like that? Somewhat. If we don't, then it's a no. And then you would simply distribute this. You could create your own this way. And what I shared it with you is if you chose to create your own assessment tool, you might come up with 10 or 15 or 20 questions like these that cover the different areas of responsibility, simply to get a measure from the board on the board's perceptions. In this moment in time, how do we do on these indicators? This is an excerpt from the tool that I do use, and you can see down this column, these are the performance indicators in one particular section. And the W here indicates it's the work section. So I talked about the people, the culture, the work, and the impact. So these are some questions that come underneath the work part. And so I'll just kind of walk through one of them. So one question is periodically reviewing and agreeing on how the organization should fulfill its mission. So do we do that really well? We put a little X, or we block off excellent. If we could do that better, we might put a good, or we might an okay. If everyone on the board looks at how we should fulfill this mission in a different way, then it's going to be at the lower end of the scale. So this is simply an extract from the tool that I use, where you'd fill this in an online survey, and then it would automatically be tabulated. This is the results of that tabulation of using that tool. So this would be the report that comes from the board assessment. And again, this is an extract, but I wanted to point out how this tool has real value. So you can see here, for example, the P. So this is under the category, the people. So question number 9 under the people, carrying out the board's legal duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. And you can see here that the respondents said 67% said we do that, we are excellent at that, and 33 said we are good. And this is all green. This is saying this board does that basic board work really well. If we drop down just to the next one, for example, defining responsibility and setting expectations of board member performance. Okay, we do that pretty good. We don't feel a lot of excellent there. We do it pretty good, but there's at least one board member thinks we just do it okay, and somebody thinks, well, we do it kind of fair. This gives you a picture of the degree of consensus or the degree of agreement around a response. And so these are just some examples. I'll go to another slide with some other examples. And these are back in the W category. So the question would be, do we ensure that the annual budget reflects our priorities? Well, the score here looks pretty good. Like they have a pretty good budgeting process and that it reflects the priorities of the organization. So you can see in this area, financial reports or overall financial health. This is an organization where the board does a really good job at attending to those financial oversight responsibilities. So that's an example of the kind of performance indicator questions that are in the survey. There's also then a checklist, and these are checklist practices. So there'll be a list of kind of what's currently in place. And this is something that typically the board chair or the chief executive, the ED, would respond to. So there'd be questions about these different practices. And the next slide actually is an example, and it's excerpted. So the question would be, you know, does the organization have a written mission statement? It's a yes or no. And, you know, at the end, you like to look at this all and you want to make sure that if you don't have one and you should have one, then you should make one. Some things are less critical than others, and some simply point out, for example, number 7 is a good one to look at. Do all board members receive or review the IRS Form 990 prior to filing? Okay, now that's just a yes or no answer. Now, if you respond with a yes, that's a good thing. If you respond with a no, that would be something you want to pay attention to because it's important that the board review that form before it gets filed. That's simple. Do we have a whistleblower policy? That's a question you need to know if you're going to be good stewards of the organization. Document retention and destruction. This is particularly important if you're providing healthcare services, stuff that's private, confidential in people's records. How long do you keep records? Do we have a good way to ensure the privacy of our patients, et cetera? So I don't need to read these to you. And I think that Nikui will provide you all with the slide deck after today's training so you can look at these. Again, this is just a sample. If you simply wanted to ask these questions of your board, this would be part of an assessment. You could do this at your next board meeting. Just go down the list and have the executive director check off the boxes and see what you have and what you don't have. And then the last part is, as I said earlier, once you've done this assessment, you really want to then do something with the information that you got. So this is an example from a client that I work with, and this was their action plan for developing their board. And I'll just take one example here just to kind of show you what it is. So financial oversight. They are saying, we're going to make sure that we provide the board with regular financial reports. And they identify that. Who's the lead person to do that? So they would probably say that's going to be the treasurer. And the timeline is going to be every board meeting or maybe quarterly. We're going to provide, we're going to incorporate training of understanding financial reports into the next board meeting. So they're saying the way we can improve financial oversight is to make sure board members are smarter and better at finances. And how are we going to do that? We're going to provide a mini training at the next board meeting. And who's going to do that? We're going to ask the treasurer to do that. Or we may ask the executive director to do that. But we would identify a lead person. And then the timeline, of course, it's at the next meeting. So that's an example, kind of a template of how, after you've assessed your board's performance, to make some priorities around what are the areas you want to improve and get it down on a piece of paper where you actually commit and get people to put their names down. One of the surest ways to get things done is to make sure there's a name in this box. If you don't get a name, things tend to get lost. So that's just kind of an example of a template that you could use in taking the data from your report. And so, as I said, these are the areas that rose to a high level for this particular client. And these are the actions they decided they're going to take in order to improve their performance. I'm going to shift gears. If there's other questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat box or raise your hand if you'd like to. We're a small enough group, you could simply ask a question if you like. I want to just now kind of show you a report that I put together from the client. I showed you a few examples earlier. So I call it a connect report. That's the connect, and I identify the agency, and it's a summary. So this now is a slide deck that might be 15 to 20 slides that takes all the data from those performance indicators, all the degrees of satisfaction with the performance of the board, the checklist practice, takes all that and puts it into a summarized analysis. This slide is a slide we just saw earlier. So this was in their report. So I put together a slide to show them this, and then I would point out certain highlights here. And in showing this board, these scores, I would be definitely affirming the work they're doing. I would characterize the work of this board. These are very high scores. If you think about it, to get, like say, a 3.65 with 22 respondents, I mean, you know, that's a very high score. So what I would point out to folks is that the work that they need to do to improve their board performance isn't going to be major earth-shattering things they have to do. It's going to be fine-tuning. How do we do some of these things just a little bit better? The next thing I do in my report is to pull out the highest scores. And so this is the top quartile. And I pull out those scores. And again, this is all quantitative data. And what I do then is I take some colors to highlight where they cluster. So you can see the three green performance indicators with very high scores cluster together. They're about financial oversight. This is the board that does that really well. So these are some of their higher scores. I also cluster for this board in yellow the performance indicators that have to do with the relationship between the board and the chief executive. Giving the executive plenty of room to do the work, having a trustful and respectful relationship between the board and the chief executive, doing a performance review on a regular basis, doing performance goals. So these are things that this board does really well. So they cluster around the relationship, and that's what I put the coloring in there. And again, I would be presenting this information to the board in a way that's easy to understand and to see where things connect to each other. I also then put in another slide in my report, which really looks at the lowest scores, where the board is saying, we do not do this very well. So here's a good example. Their lowest score had to do with mentoring new board members throughout the first year on the board. They don't do that. This board really hardly did that at all. So I clustered things that had to do with bringing people on board. And that's what the green is. How do we kind of develop a pipeline and bring people onto our board? And I clustered them. And this would then suggest to this board that in their action plan, one of the things they have to do is to look at how do we bring people on the board and how can we do it better? Another area where they looked at and said they need to improve had to do with expectations about serving on the board and holding people accountable for their commitments, and establishing attendance, for example, making sure that people know that there's some expectations about attending. So the yellows kind of clustered together as well. And so that's what I do. And it's just kind of an example of how I try to help the board make sense of what all these numbers are telling us. And how do we identify what emerges as areas where we would want to improve our performance? There's another question that a section that I include, which has to do with the don't know responses. So it's important when you have a lot of don't know responses to understand what that might mean. Typically, when you have a lot of don't know responses, it's often an indicator that you have a lot of new board members and they aren't able to answer. Or it may be a case where the board is not getting the information that it needs, or it's not getting enough information. And so I highlighted here for this board in yellow, these two indicators, following and enforcing a conflict of interest policy and reviewing the 990. 6 board members didn't know whether they do that or not, whether they have that or not. So that would simply say, how do we make sense of that? And maybe what we could do is to make sure that board members know what we're doing better. Often, I'll tell you, one of the often low scores I see is around having a succession plan for the board, for the executive director. To have some kind of plan in place in case, whether it's an emergency or it's planful, but the executive, if he or she's not there anymore, do we have a plan in place to deal with that? That's a kind of question where when I'm thinking of a couple of examples where I've seen very high don't know responses. And in the conversation, in talking about this, what comes to the surface is that the reason that there's so many don't knows is because the board chair and the executive did not do a good job of just letting people know we have it. So it wasn't a matter that they didn't have it, they just weren't communicating that they have it in place. So what it did was to help them improve the way they bring new people onto the board. So if you were new coming onto the board, you would know we have these practices in place. I talked about levels of satisfaction earlier, and so what I do is to show here how satisfied are you with the overall effectiveness of the board. So for this board in particular, their levels of satisfaction very high. They think their board is really effective. 9% respondents are just kind of neutral, but 50% respondents saying they're very satisfied with the effectiveness, and 91% altogether are either very satisfied or satisfied. The next slide is around satisfaction in terms of commitment and involvement. Again, there's a pretty high level of satisfaction here, but there's some neutral, and this is saying we have to look at this a little bit and find some ways to ratchet up that level of commitment involvement of board members. And then a personal kind of individual question, do you find serving on this board to be rewarding and satisfying? 64% of folks feel very satisfying, and almost everyone does. And you'll see here a 9%. And I wanted to use this as an example too of how this brings issues to the surface. This is telling me, and I'm saying this objectively because I don't know these people. I don't have a horse in this race, but there is someone on this board who is very disappointed with their service on the board. Now, the board has to decide whether that's a problem or not, and if it is, what they want to do about it. This is apparently a board member who feels like they are not being heard, and so they're not really engaging. Again, it doesn't point a finger of blame. It simply says, how do we explain having somebody on the board that feels so disappointed in being on the board? Again, just put stuff on the table so it can be looked at in a constructive way. And then the last thing I do in this report, and I'll share with you a couple of slides of this here, but so there's a couple of slides, now 2 slides that really say, okay, after I've looked at the data and done my analysis, these are some things that I would invite you to think about. These are some things you might consider. Okay, one of the things that your board members are saying is we have to do better at engaging board members and holding them accountable. So let's clarify expectations of board service. So this is now becoming part of what will be the action plan. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a job description for board members. It's going to spell out what the duties and responsibilities are. What are the expectations of serving on this board? We're also going to attend to attendance. We're going to not let it slide when people don't show up and we don't hear from them. We need to know why people aren't attending. We need to know what we could do to make this a more purposeful experience so they do attend. And we want to do a better job as board members as being ambassadors out in the community. So I'm saying to folks, consider these things. This is some things you consider if you want to improve your performance. This board had a nominating committee, and I was encouraging them to think about establishing a governance committee just by changing that name and expanding its scope. So up until this assessment, they had a group of people that would come together once a year and nominate people to serve on the board. I'm saying create a group that spends ongoing time paying attention to how the board is growing and developing. So it's an ongoing function, not just one of filling slots. And then I list out some of the responsibilities you could charge that governance committee with. And one of them, for example, would be to assess the board's performance. So you would be saying to this committee, you're going to take the lead responsibility for making sure we do this. And we're not going to tell you how to do it. We're just going to tell you it needs to get done. And you could do it in various ways. So pull together your committee and make sure that we're paying attention to how we perform and that we continue to improve our performance. And then this last slide, in terms of this sample of this report, this board, they thought they gave their board meetings pretty high scores. And so I was saying, well, here's a place you can build on your strengths. Spend more time in your board meetings talking about the future. Use a consent agenda. Dispose of the routine stuff quickly so you spend more time talking about the big stuff. Get reporting out of your board meeting. Reporting can be done through emails. It can be done on a board portal. It can be done in a lot of different ways. But reporting is not energizing. It doesn't give people a real sense of purpose. And focus more on larger strategic issues. So they're taking a strength that they have around how they meet, and they're building on that strength. The other part of that too is that they felt like we need to have deeper, more robust discussions. Well, this board has 22, 23 people. So how are they going to do that? So I'm inviting them to think about, do some breakout groups, break people into pairs. If it's a complex issue you're going to discuss, get reading material to people ahead of time so they come into the meeting more informed. So that's just some examples of the kind of considerations I would include in my report. And then, as I said, from that point forward, that board would then develop an action plan to improve its performance as a board. And that's kind of where I kind of wrap this up. I want to kind of bring Luis back in. If you have anything you would like to add to our conversation, Luis, or if anyone else has any other questions, and please, we'll take the time to do that right now. There you go.
It's a good time for thoughts and reflections. We are able to open mics for those who'd like to just voice a question. You don't have to be restricted to the chat box. And so we'll leave that space open for a little while. I think I like the way in which the self-assessment leads to action plans, so that the items are sort of processed and they don't just sit there kind of as opinions that don't lead to action. So it becomes more than just a discussion. And I think in that way, members can take the self-assessment seriously, because it might shape the direction of conversations about strategic plans and addressing what challenges the board's facing.
That's a really good point, Mark. And it highlights what I said earlier in this training, that what really matters is your process here. And that when I share those considerations with the board, the work is to build a consensus of opinion around, yes, those are the 4 priorities. Everybody we build ownership into that. So we all agree those are the 4 areas we're going to work on, and we're going to commit to do that. And that's very much a process question. So I'm not going to a board and saying, here's what you should or shouldn't do. I'm saying these are some things to consider. What do you think? And then they have that discussion, and then they either come to agree and prioritize, or they don't.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering how board members, people who are new or seasoned board members, feel about that notion. Any comments, thoughts?
So I had a question. So how often do you meet after? So you do the board assessment, you figure out your goals, and then how long, like the duration from that point to like a follow-up meeting, or to revisit the board goals and focus?
Great question. Thank you, Rosanna. Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One is that when you do this, you'll find that there are some things you could do that I call quick fixes. You know, one question, for example, is have we reviewed all our insurance policies? We know that we're covered. Well, if that turns out that we really don't know, well, you could correct that real quickly. You know, the executive can put it together and share it with folks. So some things can be fixed kind of quickly. Other things take a little more time. I think if you develop an action plan, it could become part of every board meeting. So when you have your regular board meetings, one of the items is going to be, how are we doing on our board development plan? It varies. There's all different ways of doing it. I'll tell you that sometimes when I've done this, it's the prelude to a board retreat. And so you come through this and you'd identify these areas where we're going to focus our attention. And then you would have a lot more time to have deeper discussions and more time to really develop a plan with really specific timelines. Some things you can improve your performance very quickly. Some of the ideas around improving board meetings. You can start, if you wanted to try some of those practices, you could just start next board meeting. And then some things take a little more time. So, it really varies. I guess what last thing I'll say, Rosanna, comes to my mind is when I think about back in social work school, strategy always before structure. So make sure you know what the strategy is, and the structure will support the strategy, whether it's every board meeting or one big meeting or a retreat or what it might be.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
I have a question. I've heard at least a couple of times during this training, the whole series, of mention of a board retreat. Is anyone doing a board retreat during the pandemic now? And if so, how are you doing that?
Well, that's a good question, Laura. I will tell you, prior to COVID-19, board retreats were something that boards that function at a high level did regularly, every year, board retreat. And it would be a once a year special meeting. It would not be regular business. It would have a focus of some kind. The focus, for example, might be on board development or board training. The focus might be on strategic planning. The focus might be on developing a capital campaign, whatever it might be, but it'd be a major focus. And board members would have plenty of time to dig into it and sort through it. With COVID-19, what has happened is that is not happening nearly as much. Some of my colleagues tell me that they've been to some in-person retreats, relatively few, only recently, depending on whether it's a national organization or a state organization or a local, would depend on what's the status of the pandemic in that community. That those are all, there are very few so far in my circle, and they're all like, in a big room, socially distanced with masks and so on. There are boards that have decided to proceed with retreats and to do them remotely. I've done a few of those myself that have been very effective, and so have my colleagues. And I think the way to do that effectively is to not simply take what you would have done in person and just try and do it online. It would be to rethink how we're going to do this, because we're not there with each other. How are we going to do this? How are we going to keep people engaged over a period of time? I did a leadership retreat 2 weeks ago for a national organization, and they were really good at planning this thing out. It was going to be in person twice. They kept postponing, and then they did it really well. There were 300 people in this session.
Wow.
But they had the technical skills, and I had the technical support from those folks that it went very smoothly. And one of the sessions I did was going to be a 3-hour block. Well, you know what? We're not going to do 3 hours in front of the computer. So I broke it into 3 different segments and had break time between. And I'm waiting to get the evaluations back, but by all indications, it worked really well. So I think and I think Laura, that's the way of the future. I think one of the things we're learning here is that board retreats and board meetings, people are getting better at using this technology, and now they're finding that it works better. I have had so many board people tell me, our attendance is right up there now. We used to have attendance problems, but now you don't got to get in your car and drive across town or get on an airplane. Now you just log on. So there's some unintended consequences as well. But it is, and I really appreciate Nikui doing this kind of series where the theme is about how do we manage during COVID-19 and still get the job done, still do our work, and still be responsible board members.
I was going to make the observation in our chat box. Walter Morello made the observation that they're doing a hybrid virtual and in-person retreat for strategic planning at Native Health.
Oh, that's great. And I'll tell you what, Walter, it's great to see you. When you do that, and whatever you might learn from that might be something that your sister organizations would welcome knowing. And it might even be interesting to put an email out and say, we're doing this. Has anybody done it before? And let's talk. One of the strengths and weaknesses of the Nikui network is the network itself. Sometimes folks really tap into, you all are not alone. You all have sister organizations all over the country. So how do we tap into that? Because a lot of people have done stuff already and learned, and we have a lot that we can share that we've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. That peer-to-peer sharing is a key feature of our distance learning, our communities of learning, and so forth. I appreciate that observation.
I'll share with you, Mark, interesting historically with Nikui, when we started doing communities of learning, we set it up with an internet platform, and very few people came on with the computer. They all called in.
That's
because there was such kind of anxiety about the technology or whatever.
Sure.
But all that's changed now, I think.
Sure. We're all getting accustomed to Zoom and Vonage and all sorts of ways of trying to make these digital encounters more personal. Yeah, I think it's something we're all kind of evolving with.
Yeah.
Well, we're at 2:52. We're close to the top of our hour. We go from 1 to 3 p.m. Wanted to see if there's any final thoughts or reflections. You're certainly welcome to add them. We have a few other items that we want to address as we close out, particularly since this is our sixth and final session. Have some polling questions. So maybe we we'll a final call for thoughts, reflections, or observations, and then we can move on to a few closing housekeeping items that we need to take care of.
I just want to add, Mark, that please, my email address is here. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime if I could be helpful with anything you're doing. I mean, I respond to all my emails, so if I could be helpful in any way, please reach out. And also want to thank Luis in particular for joining me on this session. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you so much. Tony, we need to advance the slides.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yes, sir. Yeah, well, before I invite you to go to the link, I'd like to call up a few polls that we have. Noel, could you introduce us to the polls? We have two questions that we want to ask our attendees about this training session itself. Question one is, what day for the Board of Director training works best for you? You can simply indicate by picking your day. We're trying to find out what day to offer our webinars and sessions on. So again, what day for the Board of Director training works best for you is a key polling item. And then the second item is, what's your preferred length of the Board of Directors training? You may recall that our sessions were planned to be 2-hour sessions in each of our 6-session series. So what length would you prefer? 1 hour, 2 hours, a half a day, a 4-hour session? So if you'll answer those polls, Take a few seconds, hit your submit button. Okay, I think that's, thank you, everyone. The survey link we'll ask you to go to is SurveyMonkey. That's an online survey about this series itself. I'm just in closing wanted to make a few closing observations about the overall series, and of course offer our grateful acknowledgments to all of our presenters and especially the participants. Without our participants, none of this would be possible. So again, it makes it meaningful to have someone to share with. These again, and acknowledging each of our presenters, and a brief recap of what we discussed. Our first session was described as setting the stage, and we introduced best practices for taking minutes, for creating agendas and bylaws, and described it as a key foundation for governance. And so it was an appropriate place for us to start. We reviewed best practices and offered resources that are, of course, available in the online version of that set of handouts. In our second session, our presenter, and again, a grateful acknowledgement to Joanne Schlosser. She's president of Rising Stars. That session was entitled Thinking Ahead, Emergency Strategic Planning and Succession Planning During COVID-19. Joanne reminded us of the importance of strategic planning and related efforts like emergency planning, contingency planning, and succession management plans. This was particularly viewed as a way to keep track of rising potential leaders and who may be able to take over in instances where unforeseen instances where your leadership or even mid-level management is unavailable to continue with their duties. In that particular session, we want to especially acknowledge the Indian Health Center of Santa Clara's allowing us to use their scorecard for that they feature as a board tool for sharing their tracking of accomplishments. Was a very valuable instrument that Sonia Tetnowski helped explain and was a key part of a resource shared amongst attendees in session 2. Session 3, presented by Lori Linder, also of Rising Stars, was Understanding Finances for Non-Financial Board Members. That was a particularly a user-friendly approach to looking at financial information. Lori talked about how to interpret balance sheets, income statements, and had a particular focus on cash flow statements. She noted that when looking at planning for unintentional events, looking at the cash flow statements might be a very useful approach to making your plan. Hello?
Are we on the phone?
Hello?
Oh, anyway,
this is a webinar in process. You have someone else on the line? We're finishing at 3 p.m. Finally, session 4 was by our director, Zep Fuller, was how to develop board of directors metrics and tying them to strategic plans. She discussed organizational culture. She also reviewed the scorecards from the Santa Clara's example and discussed the value of choosing metrics that could be key parts of strategic plans. In session 5, we were introduced to some of the information from the Office of Urban Indian Health Programs by the Indian Health Service by presenters Shannon Bayala and Rick Mueller. A very useful presentation that featured a lot of resources, a genuine orientation for new members in particular to the IHS process by describing UIOs. They discussed regulations, a variety of information about scholarships available loan repayment plans, and even the commission core was discussed by our presenters. That particular set of slides will be a really valuable resource. And of course, it too is available on our landing page for the board of directors session. And then finally, this session with Tony and Louise, a great feature on board self-assessment, some practical examples and discussions from real life action planning. Very useful conversation to close out our session 6 with. So I want to thank all of our participants for being part of this ongoing dialogue. I think a feature of each and every presentation was a tie-in to strategic planning, looking at meaning making as a particular aspect of what boards do as part of the lifeblood of making organizations effective. We will again feature all the presentations will be archived and available. And we began by promising you a series that would be practical and interactive. And I hope you have found each and every session having those tools of certainly interactivity and engagement, but offering practical insights that I hope you'll find useful and can share with others. This is part of what our Department of Technical Assistance pledges to do for UIO members. So those are my closing observations about this first Board of Directors series. There will be an additional online virtual training offered for board members later in this program year. It should be shaped or will be shaped by the results of the polls and also what you tell us with the survey link that we're asking you to go to, the SurveyMonkey link available to you. Let's see, can we paste that into the chat box? Oh, there it is. It's in the chat box now. Thank you, everyone. So I will ask you to visit that link to give us those final thoughts and reflections on how we can keep improving our training offerings. I am Mark Clark, your program manager for technical assistance at the National Council on Urban Indian Health. This has been a 6-session series. I'm glad you've been able to be a part of it. I want to thank and acknowledge, of course, Tony and Louise for today's session. And again, all the presenters and subject matter experts who've been part of creating this training experience for you. Without further ado, and again, of course, I got to thank Noel, who's made all of this happen in our Zoom room. You always got to keep the help desk folks happy, because you're always going to need their help. So I really appreciate Noel's efforts with all of the mechanics of our Zoom presentations. So again, I'd invite you to go straight to that link for SurveyMonkey. Give us a few more minutes of your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you the next time around. Everyone, it's been a genuine pleasure hosting and participating in this series.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.